مساء الخير أعزائي المشاهدين وأهلا مع شبكة التلفزيون. يلي سواد المسا باقوه من عيونك، يلي سواد المسا باقوه من عيونك، كود الشياهين تاصل طرة عيونك، اللي تقص العمر ويلي من عيونك. لك في الحشا اليوم فوق المنزلة منزل، ولو يطردوني أنا عن سدرتك منزل، فوق الغصن دمعتي لو ما الحياة تنزل، ونصوبوني بسهم أشوى من عيونك.
وإن القلب يرتعش منك ملهوف، تزوره طواري وسامر الهوجاس، غدا الجسم ناحل يا شوق متلوف، إن الحور اللي جمع حور قرناس، يوين يوين يا شوق، يوين يا شوق، يوين القلب يوين يا شوق، القلب يوين يا شوق. يا شوق ليت الليالي على العاشق تروح، ترحم حزين ثوب العسى لباس، عيني غرضكم يا فاتني ما تشوف، صابني من رضكم يا زين ناس. يا شوق ليت الليالي على العاشق تروح، ترحم حزين ثوب العسى لباس، عيني غرضكم يا فاتني ما تشوف، صابني من رضكم يا زين ناس. يوين يلا 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 يوين يا شوق، يوين يوين يا شوق، يا شوقه، يوين القلب يوين يا شوق. يا شوق فن بالشعر يا شوق مصروف، صدق إذا قلت لك إنك تفتن الناس، أنت شعر أنت لحن بالروح معزوف، طلب الروح من غير مقياس. يا شوق يا شوق فني بالشعر يا شوق مصروف، صدق إذا قلت لك تفتن الناس، أنت شعر أنت لحن بالروح معزوف، وانت الغلا بالروح من غير مقياس. يا وين
أعزائي المشاهدين، احنا دائما سعداء أن نلتقي بكم طبعا، وسعداء أن نلتقي بضيوف الكويت الذين يزورون البلد من مختلف أنحاء العالم، خصوصا إذا كانوا هؤلاء الضيوف مهتمين بالشأن الكويتي، سواء في تاريخها أو في حاضرها أو في قراءة مستقبلها. ويزور الكويت حاليا من أكاديمية العلوم الروسية البروفيسور بوندا ريفسكي، وهو له كتابات ودراسات حول الكويت وحول أمير الكويت الراحل مبارك الكبير ومؤسس نهضتها. رحبوا معاي بالبروفيسور بوندا ريفسكي. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
And I welcome you to Kuwait Television.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be at last at Kuwait Television.
Thank you. Can we really call you a historian or an Orientalist?
It depends on you. If you had read my books, so you may decide. This is history and Orientology. It is a history of the Orient and policy of great powers in the Orient. So it is a mixture of history, Orientology, and international relations.
Right. But there is no fixed title that you prefer yourself.
No, it depends on discussion, on conversation, on topic which I study, because I study different topics, interconnected.
Right, right. Professor, I learned that in 1940, when you were a student at Moscow University, you wrote an article or a research about the Sheikh of Kuwait then, Sheikh Mubarak al-Kabir.
Yeah, it was, you know, nearly accidental, because I became interested in German plan to build a mighty Baghdad railway, which had to start from Berlin through Constantinople and to Baghdad, and then at last to Kuwait. So I studied the German documents and discovered that the terminal was in Kuwait. So I tried to find out where is Kuwait and what are the problems connected with Kuwait. And at that time, nobody knew in Moscow about it, because all their contacts were forgotten. Therefore, I had to do some research, a small student research, but my professors asked me, where is this hamlet Kuwait? Why are you interested? So I tried to be interested and went in depth, and it helped me immense. And I am happy that nearly 60 years I am studying the problems of the Gulf and of course Kuwait.
Yeah. Well, let me rephrase it. What interested you in the region as a whole?
It interested me as the most important region, which was in history for 5,000 years a main connecting line between great ancient civilization of China, India, Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile. And all they went through the Gulf and through the island of Failaka, which is, as you know, part of Kuwait. So Kuwait started to play this historical role many, many thousand years ago. And in 8th century, Kazima in Kuwait, Kazima, yeah, yes. It became a seat of representative of Umayyad caliphs in this region. So Kazima was extremely important for all the problems connected with this part of Umayyad and then Abbasid Caliphate.
Yeah, let me ask you something about your study at that time in Moscow University. Was it in the Department of History or in the Department of Political Science? Or
no, at that time we didn't know even the term in political science.
Okay.
They thought that political science is only by Stalin himself. This was a historical faculty, and it had two divisions, Oriental and International Relations. So I decided to graduate from both. It was a little more difficult. You have to give pass examination, but I mastered it. At my age of 20, I graduated.
You graduated at 20?
Yes.
Very good.
Both departments.
Great. Well, how did you come across the information about Sheikh Mubarak?
I discovered in German publications. The German published a huge volume, 64 volume of documents of German policy. It's called in German Die große Politik der Europäischen Kabinette. In some volumes there was mention of reports of German ambassador in Constantinople and then on German consul in Baghdad about Kuwait. After that, I received permission to go in archives of Tsarist Foreign Office. And there I discovered the first time, nobody saw them before me, the reports of Russian consuls in Baghdad and Bushehr, just about Kuwait. Yeah. And so I became involved in this problem, and it interested me immense.
Well, did you think at that time it would interest other students at the same time, or was it a very personal interest of you?
At that particular moment, it was my personal interest. I tried my pen the first time.
Okay.
And then, after years, after the war, and as during the war I was a liaison officer between Soviet Army and British Indian Army in Iran, so I became close to Kuwait. And I saw the situation in the northern part of the Gulf. So it was of interest not only to read, but to see for himself, for myself, the position there.
How many years you were a liaison officer at
I
that
was
time?
2 years a liaison officer.
Okay.
Then I was recalled to the army in Russia. And then after the war, I was demobilized in Tashkent and created an Oriental faculty in Tashkent University, became a dean of this faculty, and created a chair of Oriental Studies, and became head of this chair, and immediately introduced the course for my students, history of the Gulf, Kuwait, Iran, of all these territories.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it was, I tried my best, and it was important because many of my students were for Central Asia. So the Tajiks, they mastered Persian language. The Uzbeks understood very quick Turkish language. So it was very easy for them to study Oriental languages. And based on this study, to study the history of these countries.
Did you try to study the personality of
Yeah.
Sheikh Mubarak? The personality of Sheikh
Yeah,
Mubarak?
I tried because, first of all, when I read in German reports that in the year 1900, the German mission came to Kuwait under the German Consul General in Constantinople, Stemrich, and he had discussion with Mubarak about the terminal of Baghdad Railway in Kuwait. And I saw the report of Mr. Stemrich. He told that Mubarak was delighted. Then I discovered the reports of Russian consuls of their discussion with Mubarak. He told that he gave a negative answer. After that, I went to the British sources, the British documents on the origin of the war, and then in the second volume, I discovered British reports just on the same topic. So I saw how diplomatic worked Mubarak. He used the contradiction between different great powers, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, to make his position safer. And after that, I became interested, of course, in his personality. And when I read a book written by a very prominent British author, David Fraser, who was publisher of main Indian newspaper Times of India, and was a collaborator of Lord Curzon. With Lord Curzon, he visited Kuwait in 1903. So he wrote a book, India under Curzon and After, and told about the meeting of Curzon with Mubarak. And he wrote that Mubarak is not only by face very near to great French politician and political Cardinal Richelieu. So he was clever, cunning, and so on, like Richelieu. And Richelieu was most famous in West Europe. So I understood that this is something deeper understanding of his policy, of his contacts with Turkish authorities, with Persian authorities, with German, British, Russian.
What would you say the most interesting aspects of Sheikh Mubarak personalities that really grasped your attention?
Yeah, his energy, his patriotic feeling, his decision to enlarge Kuwait and do anything, everything possible that Kuwait should be independent. At the days, at 1901, 1902, Kuwait was, as a sheikhdom, was very small. And the British decided that they will help Kuwait, defend Kuwait, but only Kuwait city and Kuwait harbor, no more. And Mubarak striked for more than 10 years for borders, for enlarging the borders of Kuwait. So he insisted that Warba and Bubiyan and northern borders of Kuwait, just the same borders which are now the Kuwaiti-Iraqi borders, accepted by United Nations. So these borders were created by efforts of Mubarak, his skill, his energy, his diplomacy.
Right. Professor, at that time when you were studying this, did you wish to visit Kuwait?
Yes, of course, it was my dream, but at that days it was totally impossible. Soviet Union established diplomatic relations with Kuwait only in 1963. And when they sent their ambassador to Moscow, so I became friends with all Kuwaiti ambassadors step by step who were in Moscow. So we have contacts. I gave them some information about historical part of my research. They gave me Kuwaiti paper, Kuwait Times, Arab Times, and so on. So I established relations on the first leg with the representative of Kuwait in Moscow. You had very, very nice, energetic ambassadors, and it was very important for me.
Thank you for the compliment. Professor, let me ask you another question. Let's digress a little bit and then we'll come back to the subject. A lot of people are always saying that Russia has always has a wish to come over to the war motors of the Gulf during all the history of Russia, all the political history.
I will tell you as a scholar, I studied this problem. The first was not the Gulf. The main dream of Russian Tsars, of Russian generals, of Russian even public opinion from approximately 16th century was to have access to the Mediterranean, to the Black Sea, which was under the Turks, to the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. So this was the main line. Then there was a fake. The French, before Napoleon's invasion into Russia, invented a faked testament of Peter the Great, according to which Peter the Great gave an order to his successors to go to India, to go to warm seas. But I printed some articles about it, and we discovered this is a fake. This was invented, it was never real. But the first time, documentary, it was during the visit of Molotov, at that day's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Soviet Union, to Berlin, and his discussion with Hitler and Ribbentrop just about the situation in Asia. And it was the question of Hitler to Molotov. Where are the main interests of Russia in the South? And after many discussions and deliberations, there was an answer of Molotov, not to Hitler, but to German ambassador in Moscow, Schulenburg, that the main interests are on southeastern line from Baku through Persia to the Indian Ocean. But this was only an answer because Stalin and Molotov were interested to listen what will Hitler answer. Will he accept Russian interest in this part of the world or not? So I cannot say that this was a real invasion or interest. Interest in the Gulf was during the war because part of American Lend-Lease supply of Russia went through the Gulf.
Which war, the Second World War?
Second, yeah.
All right.
Went through the Gulf. And I was just at this region, as I told you. So American and British ships arrived in the Gulf ports, in Abadan, in some other ports, and then they were shifted by train or by lorries from the Gulf up to through Iran to Transcaucasia and to Turkmenia, which were at that time part of Soviet Union. So at that days, Soviet Union was deadly interested in this way to have supply in common fight against the Germans.
Right. Well, Professor, let's now take a short break, and we would like to play for you an Arabic song, maybe.
Very good.
With some
Very
Arabic
good.
music.
Yeah, of course.
And then we continue?
Yeah.
Okay. right, Professor, I hope you liked this song. And do you like Arabic music
Yeah,
usually?
of course. I
Yeah.
listen always Arabic music in Moscow.
Uh-huh.
So I have some.
Well, you see, when I say Arabic music, really there are so many Arabic music. There is Egyptian,
Yeah.
Lebanese, Syrian,
yeah,
Kuwaiti,
and
Saudi. Do you prefer in particular any kind of music or song?
I am not so great expert to make a difference. But in general, this Arabic music is of great interest for me, especially that I studied Quran. I studied a lot of scholar books dedicated
You
to...
studied the Quran?
Yeah,
great.
of course. You cannot be an Orientalist, you cannot be a dean of Oriental faculty, and you cannot deliver course of lectures, which I did, without knowledge of Quran.
No.
So I studied it. I studied it, the main holy books, Bible, Quran, the holy books of Iranian Avesta, the Indian holy books, the Tibetan.
Taurat.
Yeah,
Yes.
and during my visit, my meeting with Dalai Lama, I was the first Soviet scholar who met Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama in Tibet?
No, he was in exile in North India
Okay.
in 1971. So we discussed the Tibetan culture and theology and so on.
Right, let's go back to our subject
Yeah,
now.
of course.
You talked at some length about Kuwait and Sheikh Mubarak al-Kabir. Now, can you tell me where did you get more information to supplement your knowledge about this?
I started with my prolonged stay in Delhi in Indian National Archives.
Okay.
And I discovered magnificent documents from the Gulf, the reports of British residents and political agents in Bushehr, in Basra, and later from 1904 from Kuwait. Then from India, I went to London, to Public Record Office. I consider that this is one of the best archives in the world. So I had the possibility to study the documents, the relations between Great Britain and Ottoman Empire about Kuwait, the relations of Britain with Germany and Russia about Kuwait, about the Gulf. Then I went to second archive in London. It is a former archive of former Indian office in Blackfriars Road. They have also magnificent documents, maps, cards, everything connected with the Gulf, from the 17th century up to end of the Second World War. And at last I went to Germany, to German archives in Bonn, and in late 80s we went to Washington, to American State Archives. So I tried to Xerox documentation from all these archives, and then I tried to find out what wrote the British or the German or the Russian representative about Mubarak and about Kuwait at the same time. And usually they were on loggerheads, the diplomats, so the information was very mixed and contradictional. If you will permit me 1 minute to make the diversion from Kuwait,
all right, sure.
I will tell you what was. In the year 1969, I chaired delegation of our scholars to Iran. And we went to Shiraz, and I was told that as a head of delegation, I have to pay a courtesy visit to Governor General of Shiraz in Isfahan for 5 minutes. But when I entered his study, I looked upon him and asked, "Sir, your grandfather, according to Russian archives, in the year 1911, was on the pay list of British Secret Service." He looked upon me, and then I told me, "But at the same day, according to British archives, your British Consul General reported that your grandfather was on the payroll of Russian diplomacy. So tell me, was he so clever to receive money from Russia and Britain simultaneously?" The Governor General was delighted and invited me to a magnificent restaurant for a meal. This was my result of my scholar studies of diplomacy and of archives.
And that's probably part of the danger of the archives.
Yeah, of course. It's because part of archives are secret up to now. And so not everything is published. And not everybody has an access to them.
Yes. But usually, as far as I know, in the West, they have a law or article that allows all the archives to be published after, for example, 30 years.
Yeah, but this is a law.
Yeah.
It is what is printed. But when you go to the archives, you suddenly discover that some documents are omitted.
Are missing.
Omitted, so they are put out. So some they make selection, and some too delicate documents connected with secret services, with bribes, bribery of statesmen and so on, is cut out. So not all is open, but the bulk is of course open. But the problem is to find it. You know, the documents are in different files, in different departments of archive.
Right.
So you have to go in depth to study the scheme, and then it is possible.
Yes. Professor, you have witnessed the 2nd of August 1990, which is the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. Can you tell us something from your own perspective?
Yeah, I was at that days in London working in public record office. And next day after the invasion started, the correspondent of Guardian, the British newspaper, visited me in my hotel because they knew some of my books and asked my opinion. And I casted my vote saying that I don't believe that the Americans didn't know that Saddam Hussein prepared the invasion. After that, there was a great alarm. I was invited for British BBC TV, News Night, and News at 9, and we had discussion with American scholars and even senators. They asked me, how do you dare to say that we knew about it? I told, because I honor CIA, and CIA is a very clever organization, and it couldn't not discover by their by their Sputniks, by all their means of electronic, that Saddam Hussein concentrated thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks on the borders of Kuwait. Then after that I was invited 4 or 5 times, and I explained on questions what is Kuwait from historical point of view, and explained that Kuwait was never part of Basra Wilaya. This was very important because the British public at large, they didn't understood. They told, was Kuwait part of Ottoman Empire? If it was part of Ottoman Empire, so it was part of Basra. And if it was part of Basra, so it is part of Iraq. And I explained that during the history of Kuwait of 250 years, sometimes the sheikhs of Kuwait acknowledge the suzerainty of Sultan, but never the role of governors of Basra. And this is very important. So this I explained, we used maps, and I showed the borders, explained how step by step it enlarged.
Of course, apart from this historical facts that you have mentioned, the facts remain that Kuwait also is a free state and member of the United Nations.
Yeah, of course, and we all are glad. But I want to tell you that not only Kuwait acknowledged the suzerainty of Ottoman Empire, even Egypt did the same. Up to the year 1914, Egypt was officially a part of Ottoman Empire. So it is not, it doesn't mean that the country was independent. All Arabic countries, with exception of Algeria, were in Ottoman Empire. But they were semi-independent or nearly independent, but never part of Ottoman Empire.
Right. In the last few days, the Kuwaiti papers have published about your lecture and your talks, and probably we have something to show on the screen about that. And from what we have read, you seem to be not only interested in the Kuwaiti affairs, you're interested also in the Arab affairs as a whole.
Yes, of course. I published 2 books in Arabic. One is called To Politik in Arab East, and second book, which is very near to my heart, has the title The West Against the Arabic East, From Crusades Up to Day. And it was sold out in Cairo Fair in 3 days, because it is a great interest to connect the beginning of the aggression of the West during the Crusades, 11th, 12th, 13th century, and then what happened just before the First World War, after the First World War, Second World War, and so on. And I'm also, of course, interested in the problems connected with the solution of main crisis, the Israeli-Arabian crisis, and everything connected with this. And I support the idea that the former Israeli government, the government of Rabin and Peres, suggested a good deal to the Palestinians to exchange security for land and so on, peace for land. But now Netanyahu policy, of course, I cannot understand it. It makes the situation much tenser. And I agree with the Kuwaiti government and other Arabic government who demand not only from Israel but from United States also to stop the demolition of houses in Jerusalem and so on.
You think there will be peace in the Middle East?
Nobody knows. We can only pray for this. And it depends not so on Netanyahu, it depends on the unity of Arab countries. If they are really united, have a united front on this and on position of United States.
How can the Arab countries contribute together to the peace in the Middle East?
No, they have to have a joint position on all main problems. The Palestine state, the Jerusalem position, and they should demand the implementation, by the way, of all decision of Security Council from Iraq. Up to now, Saddam Hussein didn't implement all resolution, especially about Kuwaiti prisoners of war and so on, and some Arabian countries are now not in a hurry demanding that he should implement this particular resolution. Some people think that if he promised not to have chemical warfare, it's enough. But I consider, and I fully support my Kuwaitian friends, that everything should be implemented. So the United Front is not only demanding Israel to yield in its Jerusalem story, but also to support Kuwait.
You met a lot of, or quite a few of the leaders in the Middle East?
Yeah, not only
I
had the honor to be acquainted with Gamal Abdel Nasser. During the Second World War, I was acquainted and met Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Then, not in the Middle East, but I was honored to have discussion with Jawaharlal Nehru, with Indira Gandhi, with Rajiv Gandhi, with King Sihanouk, so in Dalai Lama. So I met a lot of dignitaries and very important personalities.
But did you meet some of them in depth, or just a passing or a transient meeting? Did you sit and...
To tell frankly, in depth, I had discussion mainly with Indian leaders.
Yes.
I met many times Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi. I edited the Russian version of Jawaharlal Nehru's book, Glimpses of World History, and Indira Gandhi sent me a thanking letter. And for all this work, I received the International Nehru Award.
You live in Russia now?
Always.
Always you have lived in Russia?
Yeah, always. My native city is Odessa, which is now Ukraine. So I
That's very far from Moscow, yeah?
No, it is not far, but 2.5 hours by plane.
By plane. That's very far for us.
Yeah, but all my life I live in Russia, in Moscow. I graduated, as you told, from Moscow University, and up to
Are
now.
you Ukrainian in origin?
No, no,
okay.
no. In Odessa, there were no Ukrainians at all.
Ah.
It was a cosmopolitan city. There were Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Russian, Ukrainians, everything was there.
We've heard about quite a few of Russian intellectuals and scientists who, so to speak, migrated or wanted to migrate to the West.
Yeah.
What's your views on that?
Negative. Negative. Of course, some of them speak about financial, economic position, not only about salaries. Some of my friends from pure sciences say that they have laboratories in America, they have everything for their scholar work. But I consider that you have only one motherland in your life. And is it difficult life or not? Sometimes the life of scholars in Russia is not too easy, but it is your country. And you have to defend it with your brains, with your suggestions, with your ideas.
Right.
So it is my firm position.
You have a family and your children, and
Of course, I have children and grandchildren, so everything
and they are all in Russia.
all in Moscow.
All in Russia.
Yeah.
Professor, there was, or it is a fact, so to speak, about the Cold War between the East and the West, or between, say, Russia and the West. What are your views on that?
You know, the official beginning of Cold War was the speech of Churchill, the 5th of March, 1946, his Fulton speech, when he, the first person, spoke about Cold War, about Iron Division between Iron Door,
Iron Curtain.
Iron Curtain between West and East. This was the first official declaration. What was the reason? Of course, there were some mistakes by Stalin. Stalin wanted to stay too firm in East Europe. His ideas of including main part of Germany in Soviet sphere of influence was, of course, a mistake. But you have to take in account the legacy of Hitler invasion, the fear of millions of Russians that suddenly a second invasion can start. And they wanted to have something between Russian territories and American army which stand in Europe. And there were many questions. And they are raised even today. The American proclaimed that NATO is now a peaceful alliance and it has nothing to do with war. So my comrades, my friends, my pupil ask me, what do the American army, what is they doing in Europe? Whom does it defend? Russia is not ready to attack, everybody knows it. Yeah. And we will sign the 27th of May this treaty in Paris about relations between Russia and NATO. So I hope that there will be no more Cold Wars. We hope and pray for this.
Well, yeah, the Cold War really has finished, more or less.
Yeah, it is finished officially, but you have to spend billions and billions of rubles and dollars to liquidate the chemical machinery, the missiles, and so on and so on. It is still there. And you have now to pay a lot to liquidate all this. So Cold War is over. But the result of Cold War, the reasons of Cold War, the legacy of Cold War is still there. And it is very important for politicians, for experts, to take care not to make too harsh pronouncements.
Right.
So that, for instance, the people in Russia are on alert because of enlargement of NATO. It is, the people ask why. And it is again a question, why is this? So there are some reasons, and the West is also sometimes asked question, what did you do in Czechoslovakia or in Poland, why your armies were there? So they give also, they raise also some correct questions. Nowadays, as we understand that the rule of communism is over and Russia is also building a new society. So there are not social reasons for a new Cold War.
Professor Bondarevsky, can we go in some depth into some of your archives?
Yes, I will give you one or two examples of my findings, and I'm very proud that I discovered them. In 1923, Lord Curzon was Minister for Foreign Affairs of Great Britain, and suddenly he sent an ultimatum to Soviet government to recall our ambassador from Kabul and close the embassy, Soviet embassy in Kabul. He explained that our ambassador supports uprisings of Pushtun people in British India at that days. So when I was in London in Public Record Office and the keeper of the office was in good spirit, I asked to give me a file which was attached to Curzon ultimatum. Why did he demand it? And I discovered 12 telegrams which were stolen from Soviet embassy in Kabul, deciphered and sent to London. These were exchange of telegrams between our ambassador in Kabul and our Minister for Foreign Affairs in early 20s, Chicherin. In some telegrams which were sent from Kabul, between the lines after some diplomatic problems, suddenly there was, send me please 200 kilos of gold for the Pashtuns. Then in 10 days there is an answer on other question, and then a short note, we send you. Then suddenly he asks, I ask you to send me mountain guns for Pashtuns. And then the answer comes, yes, we will do it. I thought, how was it possible? The poor Soviet Union, it was still Soviet Russia, after the Civil War, after the First World War, poor, devastated, how can it send gold and so on? When I returned from London, I approached our archives, and with great difficulties, I received the same file with exchange of these 12 telegrams. So all 12 telegrams were at place, but nothing about gold and armament was there. So somebody included in these telegrams these suggestions, and they were reported to Lord Curzon. Did Lord Curzon knew that this is a fake or not? I cannot tell you. But this was the basement of a diplomatic attack on Russia.
Of course, yeah. They call it disinformation.
Misinformation, disinformation.
Disinformation.
And another short piece, very interesting for Oriental listeners, was at the end of 19th century. At that time, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the cruel, the bloody Sultan, as he was known, was cruel vis-a-vis the Armenian people. And the French newspapers attacked him every day, saying that he is a cruel, he has to be boycotted, and so on. At this difficult time for the Sultan, he received a letter from a small diplomat, Turkish diplomat, posted in Brussels. At that day, Brussels was nothing for Turkey. There was no NATO and nothing else. So the letter ran that Your Majesty, your great diplomat, ambassador in Paris, is a fool. He cannot stop this anti-Turkish propaganda. In a month's time, Sultan nominated this small diplomat as ambassador in Paris and gave him millions of francs to bribe the French press to stop this anti-Sultan propaganda. For 4 years, this diplomat received money and sent blueprints of articles which he bought out. Sultan decorated him and so on and so on. But by occasion, it was discovered that this diplomat himself wrote these blueprints, then paid as if he paid to the French newspaper, put the money in the pocket, and became rich and famous. So there are many of such stories.
So it was really, well, I think what we are trying to say, Professor, is that history can be falsified.
Yeah,
Yes.
it can, and it was falsified. And I'm not sure that the falsifying is stopped now. If you take the history of Iraq invasion, you will find a lot of falsification from Iraqi side and so on.
What is history? What does history mean to you as a historian?
The history means for me extremely much. It helps me to understand the emergence of contemporary world. It helps me to explain where were the mistakes done by politicians, by statesmen, by military so-called genius. What was the behavior of people? The behavior was totally different. I will give you an example. As you know, the Russian peasants were slaves up to 1861. And Napoleon, when he started his invasion into Russia in 1812, he prepared millions of proclamations in Russian language, appealing to the Russian peasants, throw out the yoke, help us to fight with the Tsar. What was the answer of Russian peasants? They went to the woods, created partisan detachment, and attacked the French. So although the French promised liberation, the Russian peasants, because they were Russian, they were national-oriented. So they study the emergence of national entity, the impact of religion, history, nationality on contemporary people, on contemporary states, and try to find out the best way out for many crises which are up to now in the world are extremely important for me. I had the honor to discuss these problems with the greatest British historian, Toynbee, who invited me in '71, and we had 8 hours of discussion. And Toynbee produced 12 volumes, Thoughts in History. So we discussed many problems, and after 3 months, I received a letter from him, from London to Moscow, saying that he considers me a great friend. So it was a great honor for me to receive this letter from the greatest historian.
Professor, it is noticed that quite a few historians always concentrating on the political and the diplomatic aspect of history, and a few of them concentrate on things like the history of the arts and the folklores of the people and of the countries.
Yeah, more of that. They don't concentrate on ethnic history of the people. For instance, there is a prolonged discussion in Russia. Who are Russian? Are they European or are they Asian? And the idea of Eurasia. You see, Russia was for 250 years under the Tatars, Mongols, under Islamic people. So there was a mixture of cultures, of nations, of marriages, of people. Russians are much nearer to the East than, say, the British or the French. So for Russia, the problem of Asian culture is much nearer. If you study Russian music, so you will find many many pieces which are of Oriental art. You will never find them in French or German or British music. Not because we are better, but because we are nearer to the East. You see, we had contacts much earlier, and we study mythology of Oriental people. We study the mythology of India, Mahabharata. It is very important. We study Avesta. The stories of 1001 Night are extremely popular in Russia.
Really?
Extremely. They are published in many publications.
It's been translated, yeah?
Yeah, they are translated. First time they were translated from French, and then straight from Arabic. And we have an 8-volume publication of 1001 Night. And you can buy it on subscription. Everybody wants to have them. So it is very, Oriental subjects are extremely popular in Russia.
Yeah, but I mean, this idea of not concentrating on the folklore and the arts by some historians. It is true, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but it is incorrect.
Yes.
You cannot understand the history and relation between people without knowing arts and science and culture and their ethnic behavior. You know the difference between the Russian and the German, between the German and the French. It is something connected with their history, with their culture, with their ancient history. And it is important to know this background, how the nation grew up. And the growing up of Russian nation is not the same as the French nation or British nation, and so on and so on.
That's right. Do you play any music instruments?
I played my early days. 8 years I played on fortepiano,
Really?
but that is gone. And instead of fortepiano, I installed a computer. So that to
Now
try
the computer plays the music.
yeah, not the music, to try to prepare my new books.
Okay, I'm sorry, because
Yeah.
there are computers that
Yeah,
can play
I know.
music.
No, I have no time for this. On this, my new computer,
Right.
first time in my life.
So
I
your
did
music now is the books and
books,
the reading. And,
no, I
the
like
writing.
very much the Western classic, Mozart, Beethoven. This I like very much. And sometimes when I work, I put on Mozart or Beethoven, listen and working.
As a background.
Yeah, as a background, not singing. During
Of course.
during the opera, I cannot concentrate. But if it is a music, then I can, and I like it very much. And Arabian music too.
Professor, we are really very happy to have you here, and we are grateful for this conversation, which I am sure will be both interesting and useful. Would you like to say any final words?
Yes, of course. I will say that this is my 6th visit to Kuwait, and I hope that I will be still alive during the 7th visit. And I was promised to be invited in January for a new lecture, public lecture. Usually once a year I deliver a lecture, so for a next lecture. And then I hope we will meet with you too, because you gave me only 1 hour, and I study history for 60 years. So believe me, I have something to say. And if we will have a possibility to give me the possibility time to explain my finding in archives of some most dramatic, most interesting stories which are still not published and nobody knows them. So if I would have special hour for findings in archive and tell the history of my personal library when there are 8,000 volumes, so I would be happy. And at the end, I wish all happiness to Kuwait, the return of prisoners of war, and I am preparing a next book in Arabic for Kuwaiti people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we really hope that what you want as another hour and another recording can be implemented in the future.
I hope and pray for this.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
وهكذا أعزائي المشاهدين نأتي لنهاية هذا الحوار، وباسمكم نشكر ضيفنا الزائر، وخليكم معنا الأسبوع القادم مع شبكة تلفزيون. فما الله.